The circle of life in combat sports can be as brutal as any in nature. Fighters rise in popularity and fame, they may even win a world title, but eventually everyone's prime years end as the circle turns and the legends of the past are fed to the hungry new contenders. That's just how the sport works, and obviously the UFC is a business. They want to sell as many tickets as possible. It might not always make sense to put an old legend against an upcoming star, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen. In fact, there are quite a few fighters the UFC has gone to time and time again when they need to give a new star a bit of a push or expose them to some new fans. I'm Balian from MMA On Point. Big shout out to all you channel Hall of Famers out there. Thanks guys for supporting us, and these are the 10 fighters the UFC used over and over to build new stars. Number 10, Edson Barbosa. Man oh man, did Barbosa get popular quickly in the UFC. I mean, let's face it, you watch him throw one kick and you get out of your seat, so it makes sense. But really, it was his wheel kick in his 4th UFC fight that made him immediately apparent as someone who could probably sell some tickets.
He is very scary. He is going to kick you in the leg until you can't stand. He's going to spin around so you can't even see him. He's going to drive his heel into your teeth.
5 years later, he was a staple of the division who would put on a fun fight with anyone, but he ran into 2 roadblocks on his way to the top: Tony Ferguson and Khabib Nurmagomedov. 2 men that moved past him on their way to UFC gold. Now, the Khabib loss had been a pretty bad beating, but the UFC threw him right back in there with Kevin Lee, who just fought for the interim title. It was kind of a bounce-back fight for Lee and exactly the same style matchup, but I'm kind of sure the UFC probably wouldn't minded if either guy had won.
Barbosa could take a shot. He's one of the toughest, strongest guys that I've faced.
The problem was, after this, Edson kept only getting top guys, and soon he was just 1-4 in his last UFC fights. Obviously, the losses didn't mean that much. He was still in big fights and was still a recognizable name in the division, but he caught absolutely no breaks from the UFC. He was then matched up with Dan Ige, who was on a 5-fight UFC win streak. This guy was in peak form on his way up the division, and although the fight was close, he took the momentum of the win over the veteran Barbosa to get his first main event and UFC fight night. It kind of became clear at that point that no matter how Edson was performing, they were just going to give him top up-and-coming contenders. Shane Burgos, Giga Chikadze, Bryce Mitchell. Even now, 13 years into his UFC career, he just fought an undefeated top prospect in Lerone Murphy. I mean, maybe there was someone else he could have fought that wasn't on a crazy UFC win streak, but of course, he still made it fight of the night, so there you go. Number 9, Wonderboy Thompson. Wonderboy is another guy who soared up the welterweight division, just channeling the inner spirit of the Karate Kid, and he tried twice to win a world title but just couldn't get it done. Now, he's remained a big name ever since then, a big name that the UFC have used on occasion to push a few other athletes. After Thompson was out of the way, the welterweight division needed a new contender to fight Woodley, and the UFC threw all their eggs into the Darren Till basket. By giving the Englishman Cowboy Cerrone in Poland, they automatically had an excuse to boost him as quickly as they could towards the title, and that meant giving him a matchup with the #1 contender Wonderboy, even if he didn't really deserve it. Again, I'm sure if Wonderboy had won, the UFC probably wouldn't have minded at all, but Till got a very close judge's decision and was immediately given a shot at the title. There were tons of wrestlers in that division as well, but hey, Darren got to fight the only pure striker as well, I guess. After losing to a top contender, it was hard to see him getting back to the title anytime soon, so maybe it was just fun fights in the future for Wonderboy. But of course, he's a well-known veteran, and he was gonna keep getting these young kids on win streaks. When Bilal Muhammad was given the Wonderboy fight, he was on a big win streak. But was that to push Muhammad or give Wonderboy one last chance to get back in the title picture? That one's hard to tell, but when we all heard Wonderboy was gonna be fighting Shavkat Rakhmonov though, well, it was only to give him a boost in his profile, really. There were plenty of other contenders around his age and win streak, but no, he got the veteran with the big name, because it's just good business, innit? Number 8, Damen Meyer. Usually, the longer a fighter spends in the UFC, the more well-known and respected they become. And 10 years into his UFC career, Damen Meyer was still fighting for world titles after showing his jiu-jitsu skills were still levels above a lot of the division. Now, his title fight against Tyron Woodley did not go his way. In fact, he was completely shut down, and the champ kind of showed the wrestler's guide to beating his style, and it was then immediately replicated by Colby Covington, who at that point hadn't really beaten anyone that would get him anywhere near a title shot, but after the Meyer win, he got an interim title opportunity. And then the UFC really did him no favors. Off the back of those 2 losses, they immediately gave him Kamaru Usman, the next guy on his way to the title. He did exactly the same thing, shut down Meyer, and I don't think anyone was surprised at that point. And for Kamaru, it was a big stepping stone up to his next matchup in a title eliminator against RDA. It was kind of shown then that Meyer was still impressive enough to be in the UFC, but wasn't able to beat these new top contenders anymore. But then 3 years later, in his last ever UFC fight, they gave him Bilal Muhammad. another top contender on the rise, and it just didn't seem necessary to do the guy like that on his way out. Why not a fun fight against a veteran? Oh right, because he's still being used to build other guys' names. Number 7, Neil Magny. If you drew a graph of most people's MMA careers, it would be a steady climb to the top, however high they reach, and then it's usually a straight line near enough down the other side. But Neil Magny's career timeline is like drawing the Himalayas. For 10 years, he's been trading wins and losses non-stop in the UFC, but he's almost never really lost twice in a row. But after so much UFC experience and exposure, you become a name in the division, and if you aren't going to make it to the title, well then it's just inevitable you become cannon fodder for someone else. For the most part, Magny got wins and got to fight upcoming guys genuinely just because he was fighting for his place in the division. But there's been a few times where his matchmaking has been questionable, but it's also what the win over Magny did for those fighters as well. By 2022, Neil was still a tough test for anyone, but found himself being matched up with an absolute killer, Shavkat Rakhmonov. He was kind of being used as a litmus test for the new guy, and then when he beat Magny, it gave the UFC the opportunity to boost Shavkat to UFC pay-per-view main card spot. The same thing then kind of happened right after with Gilbert Burns. He came in against Neil when he'd already been fighting higher level guys, and with a win, he was given a pay-per-view co-main slot in Florida against Jorge Masvidal. By the time Magny was fighting Ian Gary, it was almost like, well, what does a win here even prove? We know Magny's not on these guys' levels anymore, but the UFC still using him to test and boost their new stars. I mean, they even tried to do it again recently, giving him Mike Malott, a seriously hyped prospect, and he had the Neil Magny treatment, but that was one guy who couldn't pass the test though.
Like Vin Diesel, I'm just switching to that final gear saying too soon to the Young Bucks. I can do this all day.
Number 6, Rafael dos Anjos. At one point in time, there was an actual human Terminator in the UFC, and his name was Rafael dos Anjos. He got on some crazy conditioning program and ripped through the lightweight division, including the champion Anthony Pettis. His legacy was set in stone at that point, but obviously still loved competing enough to go up to welterweight and try his luck there. 3 years down the line, and he'd fought many of the top names in the division, getting a ton of respect for having one of the most stacked resumes ever. But eventually, after taking on the new challengers like Colby Covington, it kind of seemed that Rafael was just not at the top of the division anymore. The new generation had started to rise up, and they needed people to build their careers off of, former champions like RDA. The UFC set him up with Kamaru Usman, who was on a win streak, hadn't really beaten any big names apart from Meyer, but the win over RDA was enough to get him a title shot. And then the same thing happened with Leon Edwards. He was on a massive win streak. He was given Rafael dos Anjos, who was just 1-2 in his last fights, and he was completely outworked, and Leon was given a shot at Tyron Woodley, although that fight never happened. Even 5 years after that, RDA is still getting matched up with guys like Mateusz Gamrot, the new kids of the division who are on their way to title shots and can get a little rub from picking up a win over such an accomplished guy and former champion. Number 5, Jeremy Stephens. I think if you're being objective, no one should get shtick for having the most losses in UFC history. You only get that record for being around for a hell of a long time. And try 2007, when we first saw Lil Heathen, and of course he had plenty of time to build a name for himself as a guy with some serious power in his hands.
When I knock people out, they don't fucking move.
But no one can last 13 years in the UFC, and after his last big win streak was ended at the hands of Jose Aldo, Stephens kind of just became a name the UFC could throw at guys. There were a lot of young featherweights on the rise, and Jeremy's position was theirs for the taking. On the back of a 2-fight losing streak, he went up against Yair Rodriguez, who used the high-profile matchup to book a fight with Max Holloway right after he slaughtered him. Then Jeremy got Calvin Kattar, who was also climbing up the rankings with vicious intent. He KO'd Jeremy, and it was such a good highlight on his reel, and it came over a vet, so he got his own fight night headliner straight afterwards as well. By the time the UFC were giving him guys like Mateusz Gamrot, I think they were just kind of done with Jeremy. He'd pushed Jakar close at the weigh-ins, and I think that pissed off the brass. Gamrot just cut through him in a minute on his way to the top 15. And when you look at those last losses in his career, they all went on to be top-level guys. And even though Jeremy kept losing, they just seemed to give him harder and harder competition. Number 4, Michelle Waterson. Just because women's MMA wasn't in the UFC until 2013 doesn't mean there weren't stars making names for themselves in other organizations. Invicta was where you had to look if you were looking for some of the best women's talent at the lighter weight classes. Atomweight, they had a pocket superstar on their hands in Michelle Waterson, aka the Karate Hottie. She'd won the title, defended it, and also had a super entertaining style with a lot of traditional martial arts. So right from the get-go, the UFC and fans were expecting big things from the former champion. She was already undersized though, having to move up to strawweight because the UFC don't have atomweight. 7 years later in the UFC, and she traded wins and losses, and every attempt the UFC had made to set her up for a title just hadn't worked out. After losing to 2 former champions and scraping by a super close decision against Angela Hill, Waterson was basically 0 for 3, and so decided to go up a weight class, which only made things worse really, as she still had the famous name, but was now fighting even bigger girls. What happened next was another 5 losses in a row, and the UFC kinda spared no mercy. First of all, she had to fight Marina Rodriguez twice during the same losing streak, which makes no sense at all. Like, why give her a rematch if she's yet to win? During those losses, she was also matched up with Luana Pinheiro when she herself was on a 3-fight win streak, and then in her last UFC fight, they gave her Gillian Robertson, a girl literally just entering her prime against Michelle on basically a 7-fight losing streak. Ultimately, the UFC knew how marketable Watson was, and I'm sure they were hoping she would win some of these fights and would be able to just turn her career around and put together a title run, but it just never happened. She ended up fighting a lot of these up-and-coming girls who just beat her up, but she's remained an iconic figure in women's MMA. Number 3, Cowboy Cerrone. The Cowboy may not have been good enough to win a UFC title, but he spent 15 years in the WEC and then the UFC, just head-kicking people, submitting them, and always showing up when the UFC needed him. He managed to reinvent himself at welterweight at one point and had a great 2016, but once again started dropping losses to bigger fighters. And just when you thought it was time for Cowboy to maybe stop fighting these new contenders, he accepted a fight on just 1 month's notice against one of the most dangerous. Darren Till was undefeated and trying to speedrun the division at the time, but he'd still not beaten anyone that the fans would recognize. So the Cowboy fight was the perfect opponent for him, and he blew through him in 1 round and immediately got a title eliminator fight. 2 years down the line, after Cowboy was kind of having a nice victory lap to end his career, when coming off a scrappy fight with Tony Ferguson, just 3 months later he fought Justin Gaethje.
Why?
Now, Justin was looking incredible, so dangerous, just knocked 2 people out, and Cowboy was, well, let's face it, kind of past his prime at this point. In fact, he'd never win again in the UFC. Justin came in there and just bulldozed through him. The finish almost made you feel bad for him, and it was another highlight, a performance of the night, and then he also got a shot at the interim title. It's also pretty hard to deny as well that he was used as the perfect matchup for the return of Conor McGregor, a recognizable name that would stand and bang, but let's face it, was seriously outgunned by the Irishman. Cowboy's one of those guys who was just respected by the fans and a big enough name that people were getting title shots after beating him when they probably shouldn't have. Number 2, Andrei Arlovski. After leaving the UFC, no longer a champion, Andre started to travel with different promotions all across the world and collect some pretty big paychecks. It was probably still a good idea, but he ended up losing 4 fights in a row, and there was this moment where things just seemed to end. It was at the hands of Sergey Kharitonov in Strikeforce. He KO'd him in under 3 minutes. That was 2011, and 3 years later, the UFC signed him again, just because Andre refuses to quit apparently ever. And his return had some good moments, but it kind of had some bad moments as well. I mean, the Brendan Schaub fight, jeez. He got on a win streak, but it was ended by Stipe Miocic in a title eliminator, and his career quickly went downhill. He dropped 3 more losses, which could spell the end of a UFC career, and then the UFC booked him against Francis Ngannou.
You taking the fucking piss.
And of course, he got knocked out in just 90 seconds. And because Francis had now beaten the former champion, he got an immediate title eliminator. And if you don't know, I'm assuming you think he got some kind of fun fight after that one, right, to make things up? Well, no. He got another new talent, Marcin Tybura, on a 2-fight win streak. Fair enough, no easy fights, but again, I mean, he's just giving that guy his name, isn't he? It then happened again later in Arlovski's career against guys like Augusto Sakai. Dude was 12-1 with 2 KOs on UFC cameras, and Andre was again on a 3-fight losing streak. You can imagine how that one worked out as well. Despite all that and a battering at the hands of some of the top contenders, it took Andre another 5 years in the UFC to call it quits. So that's the pitbull for you. Number 1, BJ Penn.
How about really very sad?
Without a doubt, you go up to an old UFC fan and ask them if they like BJ Penn, and they'll tell you at one point he was the best thing since wheels on a suitcase. Fans loved him because he finished people and acted crazy while doing it. He also had some legendary moments like ending Matt Hughes' win streak and defending his own lightweight title. But even a lot of modern fans know he stuck around in the UFC and kept fighting when he was, well, let's face it, way past his prime. After he lost and then failed to win back his belt, the UFC started matching him up with guys who were on the way up, and it just seemed BJ was on the way down. Penn and Nick Diaz didn't want to fight, but the UFC still booked it, and after that loss, Penn announced his retirement for the first time. As a fan, you're going to look at any fight he takes after that with, a pinch of salt, but he'd fight for another 8 years. When the news broke that he was coming out of retirement to fight probably the most hyped contender in the division, Rory McDonald, everyone was pretty concerned. Rory was massive in comparison and then ragdolled him around the octagon on his way up the division. BJ still believed in himself though and wanted to drop to 145 and have a trilogy fight with Frankie Edgar, who was campaigning for a second shot at Jose Aldo. And that was probably the most concerning performance we'd seen from Penn. People called for him to retire, and he did for a second time. For 3 years, BJ Penn fans could breathe easy as the former champ rested, but alarm bells were immediately ringing again when it was announced 3 years later he was coming back again, not for a fun fight, but to fight Yair Rodriguez, a UFC contender on a 5-fight win streak.
Now this is getting ridiculous.
Pretty hard to ignore what the UFC were trying to do with that one. I'm sure they would have loved BJ to win, but it wasn't happening. A year later, and he got the same treatment. Ryan Hall, another top prospect, on a win streak when BJ hadn't won in 7 years. He was mercifully submitted in under 3 minutes, and whatever was left of BJ Penn's credibility had been bought and sold to a new generation of talent. Hope you enjoyed the video though, guys. If you did, give us a thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe as well if you want to stay up to date with all the latest videos. I want to give a shout out to Max Randall, who edited this video. Thank you, Max, mate. Go show him some support on social media, guys. Don't forget as well, if you do want to join the channel members, you can do as well. You get unedited access to the podcast and a bunch of other cool stuff. But anyway, I've been Bailey, and thank you very much for watching. Okay, and go have a beer with your best friend. Go do that.